going live, still buffering. Okay, and it says that we're live.
Let's confirm that. Yep, we are live.
Okay, all right, so just let everything stabilize a bit. The preview is popping up. All right, so we're good. So might as well start. So my lighting is pretty bad, but Josh Norman have all the fancy lights in the background here. So just pardon my yeah. So just go ahead and pardon my lighting. All right. So good night, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're here for take 2 of our Speeduino live. With me, I'm not sure what I think Josh is in the Speeduino sweater on the left. I think he's popping up
right on the
on my
hoodie.
screen. Yeah, he's wearing the hoodie, and we have Norman from Alpha Speed over in Puerto Rico. Is in the black polo. Right, so we're gonna do take 2 of our live stream. Right, we had a pretty good conversation going the last time, but we had some technical difficulties. So Josh has agreed to come back on tonight. Some of you may have looked at the last stream. I left it unlisted, so those of you who were live actually got to watch it. But we covered a number of things. We're going to be revisiting a few of that tonight. But for the most part, it's going to be a fun, educational, and interactive discussion. Josh is ready. Josh has his flame suit, according to him this morning. Right? Okay, so we're going to get right into it. Tonight we have Josh Stewart from Australia. We're going to be talking about the Speeduino open source ECU. Right, so we're going to go right into it, Josh. Josh, what exactly is Speeduino and Speeduino ECU?
Okay, so look, it's an aftermarket ECU is your starting point, right? It is a little bit different from some of the other ECUs that are out there, primarily because it's open source and primarily because it's designed for users. To be able to modify the hardware and change and develop the hardware in a way that they can't do with most commercial ECUs that are out there. Partially that's because Speeduino will make all of the schematics and all of the source code and everything available, but also it boils down to it being much more friendly in terms of license conditions. And really just encouraging people to have a go at creating customized units and code changes that are going to work for them.
Okay.
The other real goal, I guess, was to make it accessible. And the big thing for accessibility in terms of this market, in my opinion at least, is cost. It was never designed to be $1,000 plus ECU. It's designed to be as cheap as possible. The original goal was a $100 ECU.
Yeah, I remember.
That is possible if you're going to DIY everything. In terms of actually a completed product hitting the market, that's a really difficult goal to hit. And the fully assembled boards are a little bit more than that, simply because at the volumes we're talking about, it's not achievable, unfortunately. But that said, it's still sort of a third the price of your average entry-level ECU.
Yes.
If not less.
Yeah, but mainly, I still believe one can achieve $100 Speeduino. I guess if we're looking at a board, maybe the NO2C, I believe it's as part of the kit. It's probably the cheapest. The NO2C, and I guess if your time is, I guess, worth maybe $2 an hour, you put about 2 hours in, you can probably get within that $100 price range. But for the most part, most of the assembled ECUs would be looking at maybe closer to 200 US by the time you buy everything. Enclosures, Arduinos, VR conditioners, and everything. So, yeah.
For sure. The more people are willing to DIY themselves, obviously, the cheaper you can make it.
Yeah. All right. So All right, so we spoke about a lot of things. Hopefully, we did not overcomplicate anything. We're going to keep it as less technical as possible. But before all of that, Josh, what is your educational background? What gave you, I guess, the know-how to first begin to tinker with Speeduino? And you can just segue into, from there, how exactly did you come up with Speeduino? What is the story behind that?
Yeah, okay. So look, my background at university seems an awful long time ago now, but was in software engineering primarily. So it was, I'm a coder from a long way back. Hardware, look, I just really, like a lot of people, I guess, been playing with it for a long time. And I'd always sort of been fascinated with the idea of ECUs and potentially being able to make your own ECU. I'd worked with a couple of people who dabbled with it and those sorts of things, but I was really always interested in that line of technology. And I sort of started with other hardware projects. I'm at a rally distance computer and those sorts of things going back a long, long way. But then the hardware knowledge I've really just picked up over time. A lot of it I've got from my dad, who's an electrical engineer. He's been a great help with a lot of it. But yeah, it's a learning journey really in terms of hardware. Automotive hardware in particular is a bit of a niche. It's got its own difficulties and its own challenges. And it's a lot of domain specific knowledge there that you really only pick up with doing these things over time.
Okay. All right. So how exactly did you come up with the Speeduino? What is the idea? What is the background story behind that?
Yeah, it's something I'd been interested in doing for a long time, in terms of just making something like that. But then the real driver behind it and the push to make it, I guess, came out of it was at a conference, Linux Conf AU, back in 2011 or 2012, I think. Where we'd sort of been sitting around for the night and we'd all had a few drinks as you do. And we got onto the topic of whether you could actually do this with an Arduino, whether there was sufficient power, whether it was hardware that was actually suitable. And, as these things tend to do, we ended up placing a bet with a mate of mine for the grand total of $50 about whether this was actually possible. And after the conference, I sort of went away and I tinkered around and didn't think that much of it, and sort of kept playing with it for the next 12 or 18 months. And it was about 18 months later, I think, that I got the first engine running with it, and finally collected on the bet.
Okay. What was the first engine?
Yeah, I'm going to say that was very, very simple days. It was a really basic single cylinder lawnmower engine, nothing fancy at all. Yeah, it was.
I think I came in, I at least caught wind of the project when you were running the lawnmower engine. I'm pretty sure you had one of those Hall sensors that uses a magnet. I remember seeing a video of that Hall sensor with a little light on the back, just the magnet spinning around, going like boop, 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 and you're like,
I think that video is still on the YouTube page.
It's still around. I still watch it for a laugh every now and then. But yeah, it was the top of the engine. I'd placed a series of magnets around, a little 12-1 pattern on it, and then just dropped the Hall sensor in the top, and away it went.
How quick did it cut grass with the Speeduino?
It never did. It never made it out of the shed. It was a little bit bulky having to carry, batteries and things around that were never meant to really.
Not a very practical setup for a lawnmower.
No, it really wasn't. It really wasn't. It had the cutest little throttle body and everything on it, though. It was a great setup.
Yeah, but humble beginnings.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Okay, so from there it began to progress into, I guess, multi-cylinder cars. You recall what was the first multi-cylinder car to run on Speeduino?
Look, I do. It was a really odd story because it was sort of not long after I got the lawnmower engine running. I'd started working on the multi-cylinder code because it was all based around a single cylinder before that point. And I'd had a guy, and I can't remember his name now, I must admit, but he'd been hassling me for a long time. He's like, yeah, I really want to run this, and I really wanted to get it running and try it all out. I'm like, oh, okay, you're really keen. And I was sort of committing the multi-cylinder code in stages, and he was watching Git pretty closely. And all of a sudden, he just sends me a video one day, and he's like, "Oh, here's my my old Fiat engine running." And I'm like, "What the hell?" And it was ITBs and everything, and I'm like, "Whoa, that's keen." It could not have run well. It must have been a bit of a dog, but eventually we got there with it, and yeah. So there you go. I wasn't even the first person to run a multi-cylinder engine on it.
Yeah, you recall what year that was?
2014 or 15, maybe.
I
think probably 2015. I think.
That's the beauty of open source, because you made the base code and then someone started adding stuff and they made it grow into this multi-cylinder stuff, and then you could add some new things on the code that was already there. That's one of the big things about open source that I think are great about Speeduino, because anyone can contribute, and if someone contributes, everyone benefits. So we just all work together and make a big project out of it.
Yeah. That's how the project actually gets fueled, because someone would see they need this, they start writing the code, and I'm not a coder myself. That's you guys. Yeah, so they see something, they want to do maybe a different boost control strategy or something. They try it out, they submit it. I guess you submit it via the GitHub, if I recall correctly, and Josh reviews it, and then it's implemented. If it works, it works. That's how a lot of our...
If it doesn't work, it gets worked on by multiple people until it does work, and there it comes into existence.
Yeah.
And it's worth really worth highlighting, I think, at this point, that the number of contributors to Speeduino over the last probably 3 or 4 months has really exploded. Before that, it was sort of, there was myself and 1 or 2 other people that would do the odd pull request here and there. But the last 2 or 3 months, it's really exploded. I think we've had probably 7 or 8 different people contributing pull requests of varying sizes. The bigger they are, the more complex they are to review and test and everything, obviously. But it's been terrific to see the level of involvement really ramping up.
Okay, and then I think some time ago you actually implemented the bounties. So if there's an actual, I guess, a feature someone really wants implemented, then they pretty much put their money where their request is, and then they can set whatever, I guess, figure, $100, $10, whatever, based on how important it is to them, and then yourself or anybody else can have a go at it for a small fee. So
look, it's a nifty system actually, and it lets multiple people contribute to a single bounty. So if it's something that it's generally of interest to the community, it also makes it so it's a gauge, right? It's a feedback mechanism for me, so I can see where the features are that people are really interested in. I won't lie, I get hundreds of messages from people, and I for anyone who's messaged me and never got a response, I do apologize, but I'm terrible at it. I just get swamped with messages. I can vouch for that.
He's very terrible at
it. But look, probably half of those are feature requests, and some of them are garbage. Some of them are stuff I'd love to do, but I need to gather more details on the best way to implement it. Having something like Bounty Source is a great way to gauge how many people are actually interested in it. Is it just one guy who's really keen and telling me he's got 30 friends that want to use it, or is it actually a whole community of people that want a certain feature and are willing to stump up for it?
I have my list that I'll send to you after we get off the live stream. We've been meaning to do that for a while. All right, so we're just going to move right along. When you started off with Speeduino, what exactly was your target market? And over the years, has that changed?
Look, it has a little bit. It really started off in my mind as a bit of an educational tool. It was certainly something that I had planned to use for my own education to understand this area a little better, and to be able to help other people get involved with it more, because it is a a challenging area to break into, given how closed and proprietary it can be. In the early days, I worked with a couple of different universities and lecturers and things like Formula Student and Formula SAE teams. There's still a lot of FSAE teams that are out there that are using this. But I guess it probably has evolved a little bit since then. Some of the core ideas, I guess, around making the code as simple as possible, absolutely everywhere have unfortunately, I guess, needed to change somewhat due to the features that have been added and the complexity that's been added. That said, I think it's still a very simple code base compared to what it could be, and compared to potentially to what some other ECUs that have their code out there look like. But it's probably differed from or changed from those goals a little bit, simply to become a more full-featured ECU. That you can't, I think, continue down that same path and become a full-featured ECU at the same time. I think that's really difficult to do.
Yeah, with growth comes some changes.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one of the good things is that the code that gets uploaded to the main branch is always very well commented. All the functions make sense. You can follow it and know what each function is doing, which is really important, because I've dug around other codes and you sometimes have functions that have like 3 variable names and they just point at random things and you're like, what? I think that's a very good thing that Speeduino has been keeping up all this time, because every single time a feature gets updated, you see this is that, and that's really useful to learn and grow all this programming stuff.
Yeah, and for my end, I operate mainly on the tuning aspect. I'm not a coder. I'm very horrible at PCB design, so I just mainly focus on installation. So, but for me, the firmware, the current feature set, I find very useful. I can honestly say that on any given car, I probably use maybe 80% of the features. I mean, if it's a naturally aspirated car, I use almost maybe 70%, because you won't be doing the boost and whatnot. So the features, some may call it bare bones, but I call it useful. You're not clouded with 200 features that you'll probably never use half of them. So, and it's steadily growing, and that's what I like about Speeduino. Starting off, it's cheap, easy to navigate the interface, and gets the job done. All right, so next question on the list. Why did you, okay, let me rephrase that. Speeduino is based on the Arduino Mega, the 2560, which is a pretty cheap piece of hardware. Why did you choose the Arduino, all the processors available?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons there. Keeping in mind that when this was started around the 2012, 2013 type era, the proliferation, I guess, of cheap ARM processors hadn't hit yet. They were certainly out there, but they were much more difficult to use. They weren't nearly as well supported as they are today. And in terms of making it simple for people to use, the only real option that was out there at the time was Arduino and the AVR platform. If you look at the AVRs, to do what I wanted to do in terms of multi-cylinder engines and that sort of thing, really it has to be the 2560. That you can do it with some of the smaller microcontrollers in that AVR family, but realistically, to do it properly, you needed the 2560. Now that said, it's only been maybe the last 3 or 4 years, and maybe a little bit longer, where we've started to see a real explosion of ARM-based microprocessors that are easy to use, that are cheap, that come with cheap dev boards. In the past, a lot of these things, to buy a dev board was $200 on its own, and you compared that to an Arduino Mega, which was $10. It's a big difference, particularly when you're aiming for the $100 price point that we talked about. That said, it's 2020 now. It's not 2013 anymore. and things have changed. So obviously I'm looking at other platforms, and I can show off a little bit of hardware later if you'd like around that. And certainly that there's a lot of interest in making things work on other platforms. The multi-architecture code went into Speeduino about probably 18 months ago now, which allowed for different architectures to be built in and to be largely abstracted away. So all of the core logic code remains the same, no matter which platform you're running on. And we can simply put all of the information or all of the code required to handle a given platform away in one area, and everything else remains common.
Brilliant. Okay, so you may have hinted at it, but any plans to actually move away from the Arduino? And if you do, will it still stay here and then there'll be like a side road, a side project, and will the Arduino always be supported, or is it? Go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm very keen and passionate about is making sure that if I move forward on a different microprocessor platform, that absolutely everything that's possible remains on the Arduino platform as well. It's always going to be a single common code base. I'm committed to that. It's not going to change. So I'm not going to fork the code and say, okay, the poor old 2560 stops here, and from here on out, everything gets worked on a separate fork of the code. That will never happen. I will continue to support everything that I can on the old 2560, with the understanding though that it has some hardware limitations. The classic one that a lot of people bring up is because of its timer libraries, it really only can support 4 ignition and 4 fuel channels, or we can sort of push that out to 4 and 5 before you run out of timers. Now, there are other ways it could be done, but in terms of what I've tested and my work, that's the way I've planned it. But that said, it doesn't mean that it can't continue to get a lot of new features that will work around those hardware limitations. For anyone who follows along on Slack, we've been talking a lot lately about how we can do some fairly significant memory changes to free up a whole bunch more memory on the Arduino, which will mean that we can add a whole lot more tables than we have the ability to add right now. And I'm hoping to start work on that after the next firmware release, because it will be a big change.
So it's safe to say the Arduino Mega is not going away anytime soon.
Absolutely not going away anytime soon. In terms of hardware, though, I can show off a little bit of new hardware if anyone's interested.
Please do.
Everyone's interested.
No, I don't know why that would be the case. All right, so here's what I've been working on for a long time. It's called the Speeduino Drop Bear. I don't know whether you can see that very well, but it's a more complete box, obviously, proper automotive connectors, proper seals and everything like that, so it's fully waterproof. Inside, what we've got is
normally showing the connectors that
yeah, that's the one. That's the one. Now, but do forgive me. This is an Alpha 2 board. The Alpha 3 boards are set to arrive any day now, and I'm desperately disappointed that they didn't arrive Friday, so we could have used it for today. Yeah. So ignore the fact that there's wires and hacky things going on everywhere in this board.
Looks good to me.
But it is certainly early days testing for it. So what it is an 8/8 channel board, so 8 fuel, 8 ignition, with as much as I can squeeze on board being on board. So it's got onboard map, onboard barrow. It uses the Teensy 3.5 processor on it, which will include SD logging. It's got CAN. Just generally trying to make a board that is as feature complete as possible, and as off the shelf as possible. It's something a lot of people have been asking for a long time. And I guess that's what I've been coming up with. It will be slightly more expensive,
Yeah, I'm gonna put you on the
by its
spot there,
nature.
just where you're about to get to. Care to give a hint as to it? Because I know you were just getting to that.
Sorry, was that in terms of the price?
Yeah, that was the targeted price for this one. Or
Yeah.
is it
So-
still on the hush for now?
No. Look, I can't commit to a price because it will vary once we get to the manufacturing stage. But I'm hoping to have a unit out the door for $350 US is the aimed retail price.
Still the cheap in my books.
Yeah, look, there's a
Eight
lot of
session.
hardware on there for an 8x8 board. It's got a lot of capabilities on it in terms of hardware that may not be useful from day one. In terms of some of the CAN stuff, and the SD logging is only at very early days. But my thinking is that if I put all the hardware on there, the software and the firmware support will come in time.
Agreed. But just for some clarification, can you expand on, you keep referencing 8x8. How does that differ from the current Speeduinos? What can the current Speeduinos?
So that's purely around the number of channels on there. So it's, instead of having the 4 fuel and 4 ignition or channels that the current boards have, this will have 8 fuel and 8 ignition.
Okay, so we'll be able to do the sequential injection on 6 cylinders or 8 cylinders.
Yeah, correct. It'll have so sequential up to 8 cylinders. It also means that you can do other things like sequential 4 cylinders plus a second set of sequential cylinders doing staging. Or sorry, second set of injectors doing staging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, beautiful. All right, so you spoke about hardware a little bit. What sort of firmware and software changes can we expect to see in the distant and not so distant future?
So I'm hoping to have a new firmware release out within the next day or two. Hopefully I'll get to it tonight. I've been running around like crazy this weekend doing a bunch of testing for VSS, so vehicle speed sensing. That's working reasonably well. In fact, that's working very well. There's a couple of little things I want to work through today around the gear detection, which has got a couple of little hiccups right now, but shouldn't be too hard to fix. As soon as that's ready, I'm going to release the current firmware, which has got obviously the VSS stuff, plus I'm trying to think, there's a whole bunch of different stuff in there as well. There's variable injection angles and things like that. In terms of longer term work, as soon as this firmware releases, I mentioned it or touched on it briefly before, I want to rip in and start doing some of these big memory changes. Now, I know that doesn't sound like the most exciting things to talk about, but what it means is that I'll be able to free up a whole bunch of memory, and that with that comes the ability to add a whole bunch more tables to the tunes.
Okay.
We've already got switchable fuel tables, but there will be a switchable ignition table, probably switchable boost tables as well.
Nice.
Just a lot more configurability that we don't have today, simply due to it starting to run out of memory on the 2560.
Okay. So Speeduino will be upsetting a lot of bigger name ECU manufacturers pretty soon.
Look, it's a lot of people say that, and it's like, well, certainly my goal isn't to upset anyone, right? And that was never my intention. I'm not out there to break the world or anything like that. It's to make something that's usable for a lot of people, and adding more features just makes it, or opens it up to more use cases and makes it more appealing to more people. And that's really what the goal is for me.
Yeah, the big name ECUs have their own markets, and we don't necessarily have to compete with them, because we're looking to make a project that everyone can join in and add and learn and get their stuff running. Maybe that's not what an other company gives you. They just sell you a product and support, and that's it.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you this one, Josh. You can choose to answer or not, but I both members on a few Facebook groups, and we see this comment pop up every now and then. We often hear folks referring to Speeduino as a knockoff, quote unquote, another open source ECU, which we can choose to name or not. What say you about that?
Well, first and foremost, from a technical point of view, that there's absolutely nothing that's shared between the two whatsoever. I think this misconception comes about mainly because they both use Tuner Studio. So the front end interface looks the same, or it's the same software. So people assume that the technology behind it must be the same. Tuner Studio is a really interesting piece of software, and I'm a big fan of EFI Analytics who create it. That what they've developed is a piece of software that is very, very good at being a configurable and modular tuning package. You can customize it to do just about anything that, from what I've seen. But that said, it's, I guess, one of the reasons why people get confused, because they look at Tuner Studio with one ECU and they see one set of options and it looks one way. And then you look at Tuner Studio with a different ECU and it can look completely different. The options will be different. The dialogues are different. And I guess it is a little bit confusing about why one piece of software would look so different. And it really boils down to the fact that you can configure it for how your ECU is working. But that doesn't mean that the ECUs that are actually being tuned or anything alike. There's none of the hardware designs or the firmware at all that Speeduino shares with any other ECU. There's no code that's been copied or anything like that. I was very, very careful to make sure that was the case. And if anyone doesn't believe that or has a concern with it, I urge them to reach out to me. But certainly it was written from scratch and is completely separate from any other ECU.
All right.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
The thing, maybe as some people don't understand, the thing about Tuner Studio, even if you have let's say a closed source product, I'm not going to use any names, but let's say it's a big name aftermarket ECU, if you can write the Tuner Studio's way of communicating to that ECU, it'll work with Tuner Studio. Because Tuner Studio doesn't care what it's connecting to as long as it speaks its language.
All right.
So I just want to make that clear for anyone here that doesn't understand why Tuner Studio is used here.
Okay, so hopefully that clears it up, and then we don't get 5 or 6 of those comments in certain Facebook groups by the end of the week. All right, so you touched on it a bit, Josh, but any further hardware changes we can expect with Speeduino other than the new 8x8 board?
So look, that's certainly been my focus for a little while now, getting that so it's really a strong product from day one, rather than going through sort of multiple iterations. I know that the big one that a lot of people ask about, Dwight, and I know you're going to bring it up, is Speeduino. Look, it's. I just haven't had a chance to work on it.
Before you continue, what is
okay. So of course, and I don't have it handy. It's out of my workshop at the moment, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd hold it up. But Speeduino is a fairly advanced sort of knock controller system. That's designed to not be the traditional dumb knock module out there. So it has proper variable and dynamic knock thresholds. It has proper knock windowing and everything like that. It's a board I first tested on a car probably 12 months ago now, and I've tweaked it a little bit here and there to the point where the firmware is really solid now. It runs really well, and it does what it's intended to do very, very well, in my opinion. But that said, it's lacking a little bit at the moment. The hardware for it is only really in a sort of very prototype form. I have some grand plans for building it into a proper gauge pod, and selling it that way, because I think that's the most useful way to do it. It'll be open source and everything as well. But I just need to get the hardware to a point where I'm sort of happy with it. The other thing I need to work on is the desktop application for it. I'm not going to use Tuner Studio for that. Tuner Studio doesn't really fit. It's not quite the right piece of software for it. It's designed more for full ECUs than something like this. So I've got a little desktop application that I'm putting together for it, but it's far from ready at the moment, unfortunately. And I know I get asked about it a lot, but
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Okay, so guys, you heard it. We're gonna have to wait a little while for Speeduino. So
the one thing I've considered doing is because there is so much interest in it, just dropping the hardware files as they exist today and saying, look, this is the DIY version of it or something like that. 3D printer case or something and go nuts. But I just, it's a lot of industrial design, I guess. That's something I've been picking up over the last 18 months, which is a skill I really didn't have until then, in terms of making a product that's complete and nice to use in terms of it just being there in a gauge pod, pull it out, wire it in, and away you go. There's a very, very big step between your traditional DIY hardware and a completed product like that. And it's something that I've been really getting myself up to speed on, I guess.
Okay, well said. So we'll leave it at that. So, you mentioned that Speeduino is open source now. Any plans to make it closed source? And
None.
if so, why?
Ever. No, it'll never be open source. There's
Simple,
no way.
straight answer.
Yeah, so it'll forever be
no
open
matter
source.
what happens to it. Yeah, it'll never go closed source. Right. It's not my intent. It's not my goal. It's not going to happen.
Okay. All right. So just about wrapping up. What's the 1-year goal for Speeduino?
That's a really good question. And it's probably not something I think about that much. I want to get these drop bed units out probably within the next couple of months. Within probably 2 months, I hope to do an open beta of those and start getting those out there a little bit more and really get those released. But other than that, there aren't anything in the way of grand plans. And I know that sounds a little bit short-sighted perhaps, but really it's all iterative for me. I'll keep working away at the firmware and keep adding features to that. I have no grand plans for ripping it apart and doing some giant rewrite or anything. It's at a really good mature point, I think, where adding features is relatively straightforward, and I can continue to do that. And other than that, it's really just making the hardware a little bit more accessible.
All right. So I guess this one will pretty much be the same. But what is the 5-year goal for Speeduino?
I wouldn't have a clue.
That's way too
honestly, I haven't even thought about it.
Yeah, but on the current track, it's going to be something. Well, it is something beautiful now. But in the next 5 years, hope I'm around, and I know it's going to be something remarkable in the next 5 years.
I think that's the great thing about being open source. In 5 years, maybe Josh isn't so much into it, but since it's open source, many people can just keep working on it as time goes on.
Yeah. All right. So I've pretty much come to the end of my questions. Anything from you, Norman, before we go to the comments and questions the guys left on the Facebook post?
I put a question, but I put it on the YouTube chat. We could go, and when it gets to my question, well, I'll ask it.
Okay. All right. So I'm just gonna go. I'm actually at my cell phone. I'm just gonna go through the Facebook comments. We have Ivor asking. We're just gonna just breathe through this. Some of it we may have already covered. Ivor Hun. Where does Josh see Speeduino in 5 years? Are there plans to increase the functionality? Maybe a few new boards, 8x8, any way of improving data logging via the SD card, etc., etc. I'm pretty much going to touch on the SD login. Any plans for that in the current boards, or is that going to be? I think you mentioned it was added to the 8x8 board, right?
So sorry, what was that feature? I missed that, Dwight.
The SD card login.
Oh yes, yes. It'll be coming once the hardware for this drop bear board is final and out the door in an open beta type capacity, the SD card logging will happen. Yep.
All right, so let's gonna go straight into the next one. I think it's Keaton. Guys, sorry about if I'm butchering your names, but it's Keaton Stanley. Has there been any consideration for moving to the SAM C21N? It has Arduino support for the 2-bit. I guess you're familiar with that, and can program in dead time between outputs. Basically giving specs about the SAM C21N. So any consideration for that?
Yeah, so they're a really interesting line of chip. I looked really closely and actually wrote a port for not SAM-C but SAM-D21. They're not a bad little board. They have some limitations around, no onboard storage and those sorts of things. I guess it's when I was looking at a sort of next generation type platform to move Speeduino to for my own boards at the very least, that was certainly one of the ones that I considered. But I guess the thing I came down to was, for all of the work that's there in creating a new architecture, you don't get that much out of that line of chips. You're sort of bumping up to maybe 48 megahertz and a little bit more memory and those sorts of things. But you compare that to a Teensy chip, which is about the same price, if not slightly cheaper, and you're talking 120 megahertz, a lot more memory, and a lot more that's already on board that you can get up and go with. That said, I wouldn't object to having the architecture support in there for SAM-C or SAM-D21. I've got 3/4 of it written already myself for when I was doing the testing. So it's not that difficult now to add, given that the support is there for multi-architecture stuff.
Okay.
I did, for what it's worth, find it easier to write that than the STM32 code, just because I like getting digs in there about STM32.
You were looking at me when you said that.
Yeah, there's a lot of people about that. Yeah.
All right, so we have a next one from Peter Cobrin. It is the feature request. I would like to disable my alternator control board by offing a pin during cranking plus predetermined time. After the time is up, the alternator starts charging. Could this feature be added?
There's probably a couple of ways you can do it already, but there isn't a specific feature for that at the moment, no. That said, it would be a relatively simple one to add. But yeah, open an issues request on GitHub or something, and I can certainly have a look at it.
I'm pretty sure there's some Speeduino, like aftermarket Speeduino boards that do alternator control. Yeah. I'm not sure if the code has been pulled back to the GitHub.
Yeah. All right. So the next one is from Matt Yellow Bits Honey Will. It's a mouthful. In the previous video, there was mention of VSS and rotational idle coming. Can any more details on these points be released yet, or estimated firmware release? So I guess you can touch on the rotational idle, Josh, since you spoke about the rest.
Yeah, it's a rotational idle. Yeah, a few people have requested it. I'll have a really close look at it for the next firmware release. I guess there's a couple of different ways you can do rotational idle at a sort of code and technical level, and I really need to do some testing myself, I guess, to figure out what the best way to do that is. But yeah, I think there's been enough interest in that one lately that I can say I'll look at it for the next release.
Okay, moving right along, Glenn Roberts. Feature requests: a check engine light which has a basic logic for overboost, RPM over temp, AFR, actual more than multiplied by amount from target. I guess a check engine light, basically. Any plans for that?
Yep. It's already basically done. It won't be in the next the release I'm doing in the next day or two, but it should be in the one after that. It's code that I've written to support on these drop bear boards, which have got a check engine light output. And yeah, it's coming. These boards actually have a multi-status indicator LED on them. that has different flash patterns and different colors that indicate different things. But all of those will trigger a single check engine light as well.
Okay, so I better start saving my lunch money for one of those boards. All right, Glenn Roberts again. Feature request: a small OLED screen that displays basic parameters like AFR, TPS, KPA, etc. But before you get to that one, Josh, I believe James from Do It Yourself EFI is working on something like that. So I'm not sure if you would be interested in working on something like that yourself.
Yeah, so for those who have been around for a long time, Dwight, you might remember this one.
Yeah, you had that.
The code, it was actually in the code originally.
Yeah.
So that the actual ECU would be doing that display itself. I pulled all of that out some time back, simply because it was, it wasn't so much slow, but it was working with a display and the ECU functions wasn't really working very well together. And the core function of an ECU should be the ECU, and the core function of a display unit should be to be a display. I'm personally not working on anything like that at the moment. I know you said James is doing that there's at least one other project I know of as well, from Dale Follett. He's doing something similar along those lines.
Yes.
The communications protocol, twisted builds from him. Yep. It's not that hard to get the information out of the ECU. That the protocol for that is very simple. But that said, it's not a piece of work that I'm doing anything on at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, if I could add to that, I've seen the communication code, and it's much better to just, if you can, whoever asked that question, just get another Arduino, communicate it with the Speeduino, and get your data, and then run the display somewhere else. Because if you have some problem with your display code, that affects your engine code, and it's not good practice.
Okay, moving right along, we have Neil Yengati. Sorry again if I butchered your name. Said thanks for creating such a platform, etc., etc. But it's a feature request. Number 1, map switching for full tune. Number 2, onboard drive-by-wire support for controlling throttle and idle on both. And 3, maybe some type of safety mode or limp mode based on certain sensor inputs.
Yeah. Okay. So the map switching will be coming. We obviously already have switchable maps for the fuel, yes. And that's switchable. That's either conditional switchable or a physical input or something like that. That's already there. The additional switching maps, so at the very least, switchable ignition maps and switchable boost maps will be coming. I just need to do this big chunk of memory changing work that we've been looking at, and once that's done and I've freed up that chunk of memory, and for anyone who's technical out there, we're sort of talking about freeing up about 1.1 kilobytes of memory, and so anyone who knows computers will look at that and go, what, 1.1 kilobytes? But that's quite a bit in terms of what's left on these ECUs, and these maps will easily fit inside that, but it's not free memory that we have right now. As soon as that's done, that will be a nearly fully switchable tune. I think that gets us 90% of the way there.
Okay. I think the second one was drive-by-wire. Yeah.
Drive-by-wire. Yeah, it's not something I'm probably going to implement. I've played with drive-by-wire myself a bit. In fact, before Speeduino, I wrote a little drive-by-wire controller back in about 2010. And knowing what I know now, it scares me that I might have ever used that code. Drive-by-wire is a really sensitive topic, and it's something that comes with potentially huge liability and potentially huge problems if it goes wrong. There can be big consequences if you get a code bug or something in an ECU, but realistically, the worst it's probably going to do is blow your engine. Now, that's pretty bad. I don't disagree, but it's not going to kill anyone. If you get drive-by-wire wrong, yeah, it can be really bad. And it's not not a thing that I want to dabble with in this code.
Yeah.
So it's not something I'm going to implement anytime soon.
Yeah, it's like the screen, you can communicate it to something else, and then you can write your own code to use drive-by-wire and communicate it with the ECU, but it's not going to be integrated into the Speeduino code.
I think, Norman, you wrote some code.
I did. We made a plug-and-play unit, like a plug-and-play Speeduino for an Audi A4. So we had to control the throttle by wire. We had to control the CAN bus. And that's the way I did it. I just communicated it with the built-in communications protocol. I pulled out RPM. I pulled out I fed the ECU the throttle position through the box I made with the communications protocol, and it works. So you can do it. It's just that it's not going to be in the main supported branch. If you're technical, you can make it. You can make a throttle controller. You can communicate it with Speeduino, but it's not going to be part of this main Speeduino code.
Okay, understood. And I guess, Josh, the third part of the question was maybe some type of safety mode or limp home mode based on sensor inputs.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm not sure how that would work. I guess the biggest problems people really have are around crank signals. And if you lose those, it can be very hard to continue on in any form, whether it's a standard mode or a limp home mode.
It's pretty racist.
It's something I might have a think about. It ties in well with the error light and check engine light type functionality. I'll have a look at it. If anyone has any really good ideas for what that kind of limp home mode would look like, by all means message me or create a feature request on GitHub or something, and we can track all the details there.
All right, so we're just about almost done. I think we have Eric Minovisky. He said, Josh is a great guy. Still remember the days where he helped me and develop the first 5-cylinder Audi working on Speeduino with a basic distributor, and he posted a video link. So I'm not sure if you remember that person. Might have been the first 5-cylinder or something.
Oh yeah, the old Audi. I do remember that. There was a lot of work at the time to get 5-cylinder happening. And well, the 5-cylinder code was a bit of a hack back then. A little bit more mature now. Yeah, I do certainly remember that. That's great to hear.
Okay, and lastly, I can never recall how he pronounced his name, but it's Choya. Choya. But he basically said, I think one of the most important features is the default check engine light, but you already touched on that. I'm not sure if you want to expand a bit more.
Yeah, look, it's the basics of that will be coming. I think it's fair to say.
Okay, so again, guys, these are just pretty much all of the questions on the Facebook post. So, Norman, I have a tiny screen here, so if you'll do me the honors and just go through the YouTube comments.
The YouTube questions? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the first one, there's a bunch of questions about the drop bear, but before you explain the stuff about costs, there's my question. I'm going to put up my questions because, one of the first questions. I have 3 questions. First, is there a way we can use the processor on the Teensy, but putting it directly on the board, like we can source it and we can program it, like we would program it, we were using the development board itself? Because I see that the Teensy uses an MK54FX 512 BMD12, whatever. If we put one of those boards in board, could we use it like just as it works?
Yep. Okay. So the Teensy ecosystem is a little bit of an interesting one, and Paul, the guy who runs it, firstly does an utterly amazing job. He does really technically fantastic stuff, in my opinion. The way he supports those commercially is by releasing the code, making all the libraries and everything available, but keeping a closed source bootloader for those. Now, the bootloader works very, very well, but it is closed source. And what he does is, if you want to create a project using one of these chips directly, he does support that. And yes, it can be done. But then he will sell you what he refers to as a bootloader loader. So it's another little IC that comes baked with his bootloader in it that you hook up on the same board. and the first time it runs, it will load the bootloader into the main microcontroller. Now, that runs fine. I've set my own boards up just in a testing capacity that way. For a number of reasons, I personally like keeping the board separate like that and having it pluggable. But yes, it is certainly possible to do it yourself on your own board. Now, I think he charges about $8 or $9 for those bootloader loader chips.
And does he charge for the bootloader itself?
No, so that comes on the bootloader loader chip.
Oh, okay.
Right, you buy the bootloader loader. Ridiculous. I keep saying. But it is a loader that loads the bootloader. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it. The people that are listening to this question, probably get it. So yeah.
But yeah, short answer is that chip comes with it already on board, and the first time the system fires up, that chip will write the bootloader onto the microprocessor, and you're good to go.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, because we make our own designs with the built-in chip. So I'd like to keep it neat, because you know that board goes like this. People like, whenever they open the ECU, because people do that, they see the board, they're like, oh, that looks like a Megasport. Oh, I used a 4-bit word, sorry. So I like keeping it all on one board because of design reasons and aesthetic reasons mostly. But yeah, that's it for that question. The other one, what about VVT support? How's that been going?
Yeah, that's a really good question. VVT, I've discovered, is a really difficult one to write support for without having a car available to test on. So I've been playing with a mate's NB2 Miata or MX5 with that, and I've got it running on there, and that's okay. The problem is it's a really, really difficult thing to tune or to set up other cars for without having that car to sit and play with. That there's two aspects to it. You need to write a decoder that can figure out what the crank angle is separately to the cam angle. To calculate what the cam angle is separately to the crank angle, and what the relative difference between the two is. And then you need to have a control system that will work for each individual setup to actually move the cam to where you want it. I wish I had a better answer for how I can do this universally. But at this stage, it's really, for myself at least, it's going to be a matter of getting my hands on some more cars to test with. Yeah,
you need to replicate the cam sensor and the specific pattern, and maybe this one gives you the cam angle this way. The other one needs to use the crank to determine the cam angle, so it gets really complicated really fast, right?
Yeah, and every setup is different, right? There's a lot of stuff I can test on the bench and write code for, but VVT has proven to be one of the things that is really hard to replicate a real-world environment on the bench. Every setup is really different in terms of how you do the cam angle sensing and how you do that control. The actual mechanism for how you're controlling the cam varies a lot between cars, and the control strategies have to vary a little bit too.
May I suggest maybe the Honda K series next?
You really love Hondas.
Honestly, Dwight, I'll have to have a look at it. Okay. Someone buy me a Honda, and I'll be fine.
Okay, as soon as we get off there, we're gonna start a GoFundMe.
We can send him a K engine on a boat, and he'll just start it up in like a bench.
Yeah, but Ks are not really big in Australia, Josh. Or since you're not in the Honda scene, you might not know.
They're around for sure. It's not really my scene. It's not one I play in. Although, there's always the idea that I could drop a K engine into my MX-5 or something, I suppose.
Ooh, I like that one.
You should.
My last question would be, GDI support, any plans ever about doing that? I guess it's a bit less dangerous than electronic throttle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. from what I've seen, the software side of it isn't that difficult. The hardware side of it is complex, to say the least, and can require some pretty fancy stuff going on to drive those injectors. I won't rule it out 100% and say I'll never, ever do it, but I suspect it might be almost like a diesel setup, that it's so different that it might need to be a fork of the code to do it. I don't know. It's not something I've looked at that closely.
At least it's more than a year out.
It's not really on my radar, other than that I've looked at it and know enough to know that it's a big set of changes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to YouTube questions.
Yeah.
Can we? Okay. I'm reading here because okay. Why are there so many versions like V1, V2.0, V2.1, V3.1, V? Why are there so many different versions? It's kind of confusing. It says Mini Gamer Guy. That's his name.
Mini Gamer Guy. Really, really good question. It really comes down to how Speeduino is being developed. Because it uses an open source design methodology, which is really iterative, it means that there's less of the whole big bang, here's one version and that's what it is type thing. I've tried to separate them into families. So you have your V0.3 and your 0.4 are designed to be two different things. And then within each of those board families, you've got different iterations of them that have grown and developed as the board has matured. So, the latest and greatest, which we're about to get out, is V0.4.4C, which even saying it is a bit of a mouthful, I know. But really, it's something that's fully compatible with the original V0.4, right? That they are in the same family. The outputs are fully compatible. Everything is largely the same in terms of its outputs and its intents, but how it's designed on the board has matured dramatically, and it's a much more robust design than what the original one was, with a lot of extra capabilities built in as well. So it is just around iterating and making things a little bit better every time we do it, or every time I do a new board cut.
Yeah, that. If I could say something about that, maybe I see that the new one's called the Drop Bear. Changing them to names. Keep the codes internally because people get confused. Maybe call the 0.03, call it like build it yourself and wire it yourself, and the other one call it, I don't know, IDE, just to differentiate them a bit more.
Yep. No, I think that's a really good idea, actually. And it is confusing. And it all just stems from the days when this was a purely DIY project, right? The V0.4 was the fourth board I designed. It's simple as that. And then there were just different iterations of the same board.
I recall sometime, Josh, I'm not sure if we spoke about it privately or if it was on the group, one of the groups, but you did mention wanting to change the names from the 03, 04 to actual names. I'm not sure if we had that privately or if it was in the group at some time.
Yeah, look, I do remember discussions like that, and it was honestly a really good idea something I never followed up with.
Another question here by Hobby Derp. Is there any chance of getting table interpolation as part of the Flex implementation? That would make me very happy.
Table interpolation as part of Flex. I'm trying to understand what that would mean.
I suppose that means having two tables and have it like cross between them.
Yep. So that there is already the capability there in the latest firmwares to use the second fuel map with a load source of being ethanol content and blend it live with the main map. So I'm not sure if that's the sort of feature that you're thinking of, but that's already there.
Yeah, I'd suppose it's that because when I've tuned the 85, I've seen it like maybe in idle, since your injectors don't behave the same way they behave when they're operating at bigger pulse widths. You maybe need a little bit less fuel at idle, and if you just have one value, it just makes it run way too rich and idle, and then it just runs weird up top. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what he meant.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then that's already there. Grab the latest firmware and you're good to go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And we expecting a new firmware, like you said, in a few days, maybe two days max.
Look, if my playing around with the gear detection stuff today goes well, it'll be tonight.
All right, brilliant. I may just not go to work tomorrow.
Can you explain the difference between batch and sequential? I'm pretty sure you can pretty much find that in most ECU docs.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah, just look for it. It'll pop up. Most ECUs on Earth, when they say batch or sequential or semi-sequential, they all work the same way. They all mean the same thing, so you can probably look for it.
And it makes very little difference.
Yeah. It depends, but yeah, there's sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. Yeah, you can find that information that's not specific to Speeduino.
Yeah.
So there's this long and complicated. Will you develop an ECU to support K-series Honda motors with dual maps for turbochargers, iVTEC and VTEC low profiles, and when do you thanks?
Best question all night.
By RSA Dynamics.
Yeah, I guess we sort of touched upon it a little bit. I'd love to, is the short answer. It's just a matter of how I can go about testing on one of those.
Yeah, like you said, you actually need a vehicle there because it's not an easy task. It takes a lot of hours to actually get a plug and play working just right. Yeah. So you actually need a
agreed.
Dr. Zoidbergism asks, what about CAN support for other things? I want to communicate with my hybrid motor controller. I can try to answer that. You can answer that. I'm pretty sure CAN is coming on board on Drop It, right?
Yeah, it certainly is. That's firmly in the probably 12-month plan. Yep. Okay. That there's going to be some much more complete built-in CAN support coming.
And we're going to have like a table that tells us this CAN address is this data, this CAN address is this data. You're going to make something like that public, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's certainly the goal. Well, that's certainly my goal. I haven't started writing the code for it, so it could turn out to be really hard.
Okay. Perwire, now I'm going to butcher this name. Perwira Saputra asks, can I monitor the oil pressure and fuel pressure on Speeduino /Tuner Studio? Someone answered him. Okay, yeah.
That's actually a really good one. I'd like to touch on it, even if somebody sort of mentioned it in the comments. It's that those are really simple functions, and whilst they don't exist today, they should. It's not hard to write them in and calibrate a sensor for it. So yeah, chalk that one up to me being a little bit slack, because that functionality is not that hard to add. So I should get around to doing that.
Yeah, and you touched on it a little bit, but something that may come in is just tie that into, I guess, the check engine light and maybe some fail-safes for oil pressure and overheating and whatnot. So that's something you can look into.
Yep.
Okay. Callum Maitland asks, any thoughts on using a board with a 2560 Pro mini board that's popped up on AliExpress? It's a small 2560 board.
Yeah.
It's a much smaller board. Weaver answered him, but he didn't tag him. So Weaver said the issue is that there are multiple versions of the mini boards and they're not as easy to come by, and they're all wired a bit different. So that's
one of them.
That's pretty much the answer.
Yeah, and look, that is the right answer, unfortunately. They're not a standard shape, size, or anything else. If somebody wants to get one that's solid and buy 1,000 of them, then that's fine. But it's not something that I'll probably look at doing.
Let's see. Pablo Alvarez asks, how about just rescaling one table to get all my tables get the same scale? I'm pretty sure he means like if you change the load table on your fuel tank, have it change on the ignition table too.
That is annoying, trust me. It's very annoying. But I think that's Tuner Studio, not exactly Speeduino.
Yeah, exactly. That's a tricky one.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can duplicate it, but then you can't have on specific cases. You might need fuel running from TPS, and you might need ignition running from MAP. And then if you tie them both together, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a tricky one. I guess that probably the easiest way I could think to do it would be to export the fuel map and then load it into the ignition table. That will give you the same axes values, and then you can just modify the table as you see fit.
Yeah.
I don't know. You're right. It's a Tuner Studio type question, and that there's only so much you can do with that, I guess. Yeah, I don't have a really great answer there, unfortunately.
Neither. I just know it's very annoying to adjust the fuel table, especially if you're using two fuel tables, the axes on both, and the SPAC and the AFR table.
But what I will say is that back in about 2014 or 15, on the really, really early versions of the code, to save memory space, the two were actually using the same array. So when you changed one, it automatically changed the other. And so many people complained when they were using it in the early days that it was made separate. And they should be separate, let's be honest.
Yeah. What else? Randall Rafael Reyes Rodriguez asked, can you help us with the creation of the decoder for a Toyota 24+1? I've seen that one hopping around on the forums a lot.
Yeah, the Toyota and the Honda decoders, the stock distributors, they've pretty much been the bane of our existence for a little while. I think it's not Speeduino's problem. It's I'll let you get to it, Josh. But I think the problem is actually in Toyota's actual wiring of the distributor. What they did, they shed the grounds between the VR sensors, and what it does, it just results in a lot of noise. Some ECUs have gotten it to work, but unfortunately, it hasn't worked pretty good with Speeduino. So I'm not sure if you have anything specific in plan for that.
So I'll make a couple of comments about that because it's a good question. The first is that if you've got a decoder pattern or anything like that that you want to see that's not currently supported, create a request on GitHub for me, title it well, and dump all of the info you can possibly find into it. So whether you've got, manufacturer diagrams or scope traces or anything like that, dump them in there because those things make it much easier for me to do. And the less work I have to do chasing around trying to find timing diagrams and that sort of thing, the more time I'm going to have for actually coding it. The second is around the Toyotas that on the hardware side, they do some really weird things, particularly the ones where the two sensors, they're two VR sensors, but share a common ground.
G1 and G2?
On the sensors. Yeah, it's a real nightmare to try and support those. The best solution I've seen is running a second ground wire for one of those sensors. But the Toyota do some really unique and weird things in their VR conditioner that they build in that doesn't work with a generic VR conditioner, and certainly not the Max 9926 or anything like that. Yeah, so there's a perfect example of a GitHub request here. Somebody's got a picture of the board. If you can find, if you look there, there's one for the 7X, GM 7X, which is supported but has a few bugs. I can't remember where it is. Yeah, the fourth from the top. There you go.
Yep.
So if you have a look at this, once it loads, you should see all of the timing diagrams and everything. I've just dumped the ideas in there, but it lets me have a single place where I can just look at it when I start coding to try and figure out what's going on and what I need to do.
Yeah. I opened the page so people could see. You just go there, go to issues, click create an issue or open an issue, and post everything you can find. You can probably find it on the internet because I've done it before. I spanned the issues area, try to post whatever information you can post, maybe a oscilloscope trace, anything that can help to make the decoder, and it'll probably happen, at least with some time.
Yep, I get there eventually. It's a long list. I really do need to prune it out. Some of those things have really been done. Some of them won't be done. All those sorts of things. But yeah, that's the best advice I can give. Put a request in, and we can get all the discussion happening in one place.
Okay. Adam Yates asks, and I have a sort of answer for this. Maybe I can answer it and then you can add something on it. He says, when reading reviews, I found some people feel it's not fully capable of running on its own and it's better as a piggyback. Are there any major limitations for running on its own? He says he has a Starlet, a 94 Starlet. Honestly, a 94 Starlet, we have done it before. Speeduino can run it just fine. There's nothing complicated about it. It uses an idle valve, uses a supported trigger. And
actually a pretty simple engine.
yeah. If you wire it correctly and you tune it correctly, it'll work just fine. Maybe for newer cars with electronic throttle bodies, variable valve timing there, you need to use it as a piggyback because there's a bunch of stuff that still hasn't matured in Speeduino. But and most cars before 1999, you can run them fully plug and play and everything will work as long as you wire it correctly and you tune it correctly.
You want to add anything, Josh? Josh?
No. Yeah, you guys are awesome. You've covered it all.
Detonation asks, will there be any chance to get a larger fuel or timing map 32 by 32?
Probably not.
Before you get to Josh, Josh, I hope not, because I personally believe 16 by 16 is large enough, and interpolation, you don't need anything bigger. But again, you can give your angle on it.
Yeah, look, I very much think the same. There are some use cases out there for wanting a 32 by 32 table, but they're probably not the ones that most people are thinking of. I know it's the ECU world, and bigger numbers means better ECUs, right? We all know that. But in the real world, I don't think there's that much advantage to it. The only place I've seen it where it's really needed is where you have extreme nonlinear load sources. And typically that comes about with really big, slow kicking turbos and things like that, where you might be running 2.5 plus bar of boost. So you need a load table that goes up pretty high, and the boost kicks in a really late stage in the RPM and those sorts of things. It's, yes, those cases do exist, but I think they're rare. And I think for most people, it's just going to be an annoyance rather than a benefit.
And more to that level, I guess they probably won't be using a Speeduino by the time they get to the point where they need these sort of things. You're looking at some top level of motorsport. But before we continue, Norman, it was also mentioned in, I think, the Speeduino group some time ago, and I actually meant to do it, but on the High Performance Academy's, I think one of the courses, they will use the Link G4, and they pretty much use a 4x4 table to tune the entire car. So the car was tuned on, I think, a 16 by 32 or whatever it was. It made about 200 and something wheel horsepower, and they shrunk that table down to a 4x4. So only 2 on the X, 2 on the Y, and the car made within 5 horsepower of the 16 by 32 or whatever it was. With just a slight lean spot in the bottom because of the lack of, I guess, resolution in the table. But just goes to show that you don't need it. You can tune an entire car with a 4x4 table.
Yeah, they made a video with a Haltech running the V table was one cell, and they just obviously they used a bunch of other equations and built into the ECU, but it shows you that you don't need a 32 by 32. There might be a case, but I don't. Yeah, as Josh said, it's probably not within the scope of Speeduino. Anyone that really wants a Speeduino doesn't need that kind of memory.
This is just trying to be difficult.
There's a. Just a shout out. Rusefi Andre is here. He asks, no love for Rusefi.
Well, shout out to Rusefi.
Yeah. Let's see. There was big enough. No, there's no questions after
I'll
that.
shout out for Russ EFI because I think they're awesome. I think you guys are doing great work.
Russ EFI. I thought it was an actual name.
Oh no, yeah, it's I call it Russ EFI.
Russ EFI.
But I don't have. I have my Russ EFI stickers somewhere in my room. I was looking for them, but I didn't find them.
Yeah, but
I also
do pretty good work as well.
It's pretty cool, and their way of doing things is pretty interesting too. So if there's any programmers here, take a look at it because it's also a pretty interesting project.
I did see a comment somewhere up in I'm following along with the YouTube comments here as well. When we were talking about, the oil pressure and fuel pressure and those sorts of things, and someone made a comment about, can you do a tutorial or something? That's a perfect sort of feature that I could probably do a live coding session on if anyone was interested. It really wouldn't take that long to do. It would maybe be an hour and a half type session. And I can walk through going from nothing to having that sort of feature added and running because it's really not that complicated.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, just wanted to mention that Josh's Facebook has been revamped. I checked it out. It used to be titled after himself, Josh Stewart, but now named it to Speeduino. And I think, Josh, you also mentioned that you have the intention of doing a bit more live videos and pretty much putting out some content. So for anybody who has not subscribed or anything, they need to go over and show Josh some support, and then hopefully he'll give us some live streams and some more video content on the Speeduino, official Speeduino YouTube page.
Yeah.
Look, I'm terrible with video stuff, but I'm more than happy to throw some stuff out there and do some live streams if people are interested.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a need for those live streams because you get the interaction. Pretty much what we're doing now. But nothing else in the comments, Norman?
Adam Yates has another good question that I think he asked. It's not exactly a coding question, but when does wiring have to be hardwired? I found there's a Miata plug that solders to the board, but no options for other vehicles. Does it just use a standardized plug?
I'm not sure I follow that question.
I'm pretty sure the question is when do I know that I have to throw away my stock wiring and just wire my own harness up to the injectors and such? When is it good to know? Like, I'm pretty sure that's what he asked. Because when wiring does it have to be hardwired?
Okay, well, for me, the turnaround point was when I'm on I guess a traffic light, and then for some random reason the car refuses to start. At that point, the stock wiring has to go, then you make a harness.
That's pretty much if you have a way to test your cables and your plug, you check from end to end, and if you move the cable and you have different readings, you know that the stock wiring harness has to go.
Yeah, but you can have a go at the question, Josh.
One thing I would recommend for people to try if they're interested is doing their own little adapter boards because they're not that difficult and they're not that expensive anymore. Getting a PCB created now is crazy compared to what it was 10 years ago. It cost you, $20 shipped to your door for 5 PCBs as long as they're small. And actually doing that is really not that difficult. So it's something that I would certainly recommend people have a crack at. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but they're really not that complicated. And there are already PCB footprints and those sorts of things out there for an awful lot of boards. I know I've done the one for the MX-5 or the Miata, simply because it was my own, that was what I needed, so that was what I made. But there's an awful lot out there that people have created already, and they do make life a lot simpler.
Yeah, see, I put an example up here on the stream. You can see that this converts to the Miata/Toyota/Mitsubishi 76-pin plug. You can just basically buy the plug off DigiKey and just pin it out to whatever you want. I pinned it out to a few ATX connectors, and then you just switch it from being the Mitsubishi plug to whatever other connector, or you can put a bunch of holes and wire and solder your own wires on it, and you can make your own plug and play harness, and it's pretty easy. I'm showing it here so you guys can get an idea. Maybe have your own made.
Yeah. Shameless plug.
Sounds like another
myself.
live stream, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Shameless plug for myself, but I actually made one of those boards. Well, I have a second one out. It's the SSOBD one. So it's the same 72-pin plug. But what I did was I wanted it to be based on the V0.4 and not the other ECUs, because with the V0.4, you can just use the ribbon cable and then plug it into that board. So there's no actual wiring. So my idea behind it was you plug in the ribbon cable to the board, and then you basically have the holes where you simply match the pins from the ribbon cable to this. So it's just basic soldering. And I mentioned it some time ago, but I actually have one specific for the Hondas. I actually have the board. Should be testing it pretty soon, so it'll be pretty much plug and play. And I prefer that method than actual plug and play boards, because in my mind, when you put whatever amount and then you buy a plug and play board for, let's say, a Nissan Skyline, say you own a Nissan Skyline now, and you buy a plug and play ECU for Nissan Skyline, 2 months down the road, you fall on a rough patch, you need to sell that Skyline. The new owner might not be interested in buying the ECU, but guess what? You're stuck with an ECU that is specific for a Nissan Skyline, so it's difficult to resell. So then hence the idea Josh brought up about making the adapter board. So you rip out the adapter board and you sell the universal ECU. So the next guy can take that universal ECU and install it on a RX-7, on a Honda.
You buy another car, you make your own patch harness, and you can keep using your own ECU.
Yeah. So you're not confined to the factory wiring. So hence why the adapter boards are a pretty good idea. And like you just said, they're pretty easy to make. You can use stuff like easyeda.com. It's a very simple site, boards and whatnot. Just playing around with it for a few hours, you can knock out a board in no time.
Okay.
Anything else, Norman?
Not really. Adam thanked us. Thank you for tuning in. Joel thanks you for setting this up, because it's been pretty cool. And
I agree. Big thanks to both you guys for helping facilitate this. It's been great.
And
a lot more successful than the last one, I think. So well done.
Now we can have a nice stream with nice stream quality.
All right, but I think Norman deserves most of the credit. He's doing most of the hard work in the background, so I guess
it's okay, man. It's all part of the project. That's the cool thing about Speeduino. I keep praising the open sourceness. It brings people. I'm in Puerto Rico. Where are you from?
St. Lucia.
Yeah, you're in St. Lucia. You're pretty close by. And Josh is in the other side of the world. We're all working together on basically the same project. So making these kinds of things is pretty fun. Interacting with people, everyone needs to. It's good to learn as a community. So
I agree.
Yeah, but we plan on doing it maybe about once a month, give or take. The next one, we have a couple guests, couple persons we want to feature. Josh is free to hop on if he feels or he has the time the next time. But we have the personalities, but that's basically the idea behind the live stream. So the persons want to ask the questions. So Josh, Norman, maybe Norman will have a show just for himself. We have guys like Weaver, the guys from DIY-EFI, guys like Pazzi, David on Slack, and James from Do It Yourself EFI, Chris and Isaac, and the whole bunch. So the plan is to actually get persons on board, and then maybe down the road we can probably, I think we've exhausted, I guess, the list, quote unquote, we can probably just have a panel discussion. So maybe once a month we just hop on board, and then the audience just fires questions at us, and then we answer them in real time. That's the end goal, I guess, for the live streams.
If I can plug myself a tiny bit, the streams you said I make them in Spanish, because the people I usually deal with are Spanish-speaking in Latin America, because I'm in Latin America. If you can hit like on my page, Alpha X, little thing there, if you want to see it, you can find that page on Facebook and like it, and that would make me really happy. And
All right.
yeah.
Norman put out some good product as well. But again, Josh, yeah, we're gonna wrap up. Before we say good night or good morning.
Look, nothing else for me other than a big thanks to you both. It's been terrific.
Hey, thanks to you for the opportunity. It's been pretty fun.
All right. Anything from you, Norman?
Thank you guys for inviting me again. I set it up, but I still got an invitation. I like speaking with people. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone on stream. The questions were really good. And if we can keep growing, having more people on, making more discussions like this, it would be great.
All right, beautiful. So I'm not sure how far along. I'm not sure if there's a lag in the stream. So I'm just gonna let it run for about a minute, and I'm just gonna end the stream because the last time some folks complained that it ended abruptly. All right. So
yeah, okay. I'll cut off the stream. So we'll say our goodbyes. See you guys.
Right. Thanks to everyone for watching. Stay safe.
Have a good day.
All right. So you can sign us out, Norman, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, legally